Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for the second panel. If you were with us on the first one, you got a lot of really great information and looking forward to continuing that in the second session. The Appraisal Foundation and the Appraisal Institute are pleased to be hosting this joint valuation symposium on promoting trust in fair and affordable housing. I'm Jim Amron. I'm the current CEO of the Appraisal Institute, and I'd like to also introduce my co-moderator, Johnny White, who is the CEO and EVP of the American Society of Appraisers. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. Each of the panels we are hosting as part of the symposium has its own unique Zoom join link. So please visit appraisalfoundation.org and click on events to register for each session. We hope you join us for all of these sessions. This will be the last one for today, and there'll be two more tomorrow as well. Please make sure that your chat box is open. Staff will be sharing important links, and you can submit questions for the Q&A portion of this panel through the chat feature. Johnny and I will read your questions after each speaker's presentation. And finally, we ask you to take just a few minutes at the close of this session to answer questions in our brief survey about today's event. This will help us to continue to ensure that we provide the best possible user experience for future events. We are really thrilled that so many of you have taken the time to join us today, and we're glad that each of you have the opportunity to hear from our wonderful panelists. Each panelist will present, followed by a Q&A session. We are on a pretty strict timetable, so we may not get to every question today, but we will do our very best to answer as many as possible. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. It is my pleasure to introduce Lisa Dismaris. Lisa is the Vice President of Appraisal Issues with the Appraisal Foundation, and Mr. Byron Miller. Byron is the owner of BM Appraisals, and Lisa and Byron, the floor is yours. So take it away.
Great. Thank you, Jim. On behalf of Byron and myself, I just wanted to say we are honored to have been asked to present information about the appraisal profession, and more specifically to discuss the history of racial bias with regard to mortgage lending and its lingering impact to the present day. We have just heard from three reputable research experts about current perceptions by the public that appraisals in certain instances have what appear to be indications of racial bias. While appraisers have no control over what people pay for homes, and thus what the actual sales prices are in each neighborhood in America, we do have control over how we conduct our research and how we communicate about value. Given that the very cornerstone of our profession is its ability to earn and maintain the public trust in its services, we can never hide from, deny, or ignore any of the concerns that the public has about the appraisal process. Part of our job as appraisers is to understand any issue that the public believes needs to be addressed, even if that topic is uncomfortable and difficult. In other words, this is not the time to disagree with many who represent the Black population's experience or view of the appraisal process. Perception is reality. If the public perceives a problem, then as far as the appraisal profession is concerned, then that is the reality. Currently, the concern we are hearing is that in some instances, Black homeowners believe that their appraisals, which are conducted for lending assignments in neighborhoods consisting of predominantly Black residents, are not done with complete and utter objectivity, and more directly, that there is a weakness in our system that can allow racially biased conclusions to either inadvertently or purposefully exist in our appraisals. However, since the appraiser's greatest skills are identifying problems, identifying data that can help solve a problem, identifying strengths and weaknesses in any applicable data, and in communicating impartial conclusions, then while uncomfortable, having this very difficult conversation here today is right in our wheelhouse. Today's agenda then is as follows. We have 6 topics, and Byron and I will take turns covering the topics. We'll cover public trust, the science behind bias, the history of bias in our profession, the present, some data, appraising and bias, and finally we'll have a summary. Section 1, public trust. In the summer of 2018, the appraisal profession started to hear the murmurs of concern the public was having with regards to our profession. Specifically, the Brookings Institute issued a research paper called The Valuation of Assets in Black Neighborhoods. While not specifically directed at appraisers, it discussed some very important issues about how America ended up in a place where predominantly Black neighborhoods. Hold on just a second. Can you go one slide further? There you go. Thank you. Thank you. While not specifically directed at appraisers, it discussed some very important issues about how America ended up in a place where predominantly Black neighborhoods had sales prices notably lower than predominantly white neighborhoods. In hindsight, it was probably expected that eventually appraisers would be called to explain bias and how it can impact appraised values in lending assignments because the Brookings Institute research paper discussed value and because people in the United States has been shifting more and more towards really taking a very frank look at how Black people have been treated in this society. And that's okay that the focus has turned to us. This is, like I've said, not a comfortable discussion, but it is very much about how Black people have been treated in our country over time. Meaning that, yes, this discussion is very bluntly and specifically about Black people and how they're being treated. No other race has been singled out so exclusively as to be the one race on the receiving end of one bad racist government housing policy after another. So if a staff member of Congress can and did say to me, Black people believe the appraisal system discriminates against them specifically, then it's my duty to hear that. It's not my place to defend what I believe about myself. It's about what they believe. Public trust is not about what I understand in my mind, but about what the public believes about appraising. And if the majority of one large group of people feels that it's their time to say, your system shows racial bias, then I'm listening. It's time to put aside any defenses and do what every appraiser is trained to do. Objectively listen to what the problem is and then work to solve the problem in a way that is meaningful and not misleading to the parties who stated that they have a problem to solve. Appraisers are entrusted with an especially unique position of being required to train themselves to be fastidiously aware of the natural human condition to have bias. And it is only in understanding where personal biases exist that one can train themselves to pick up on the biases they have and work against them. So before we get into the bias as it relates to appraisals, we need to have a quick look at understanding the science of bias and from a human perspective, what it is. Byron, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. So before we get into the science of bias, let's discuss what it is and isn't. And let me start by telling you a story about jelly. I'm going to go old school on you folks. I'm going to take you back, way back, as we say, back to 1969 in the kitchen of a Minneapolis home, just a few blocks from where the city was still reeling from the effects of the 1968 race riots. My best friend's mother, Mabel Brewer, who was a social worker by trade, gave me my first lesson in bias. She asked me what kind of jelly I liked, and I answered with strawberry. She responded by telling me that she preferred grape jelly to strawberry jelly. She went on to say that she was biased towards grape jelly and biased against strawberry jelly. Wow. Now that was my first introduction as an 8-year-old on bias. Most of us think we know what bias is, right? Well, remember, bias can be positive, negative, or neutral. We all have it, and another word for it is preference. Bias is often associated with prejudice, but not always the case. Most importantly, keep in mind that for this session, when we're talking about bias or being biased, it does not mean that we're being racist. Next slide, please. Now, when we're discussing bias, it's important to specify what kind of bias we're talking about. Now, when Lisa and I were researching the symposium, we searched to see how many categories of bias there were. And we found over 180 of them. And if you look at this slide, that's just a subset right there. We listed a few, and I'm going to talk about the definitions of a couple of them just to give you an idea of how bias differs. So a big one that we talk about in our profession, confirmation bias. And the bias of confirmation is a tendency to search for and interpret or favor or recall information in a way that confirms or supports one's prior beliefs or values. People tend to unconsciously select that views that support their thought process, ignoring non-supporting information. Another type of bias is anchoring bias. It occurs when people rely too much on pre-existing information or the first information they find when making decisions. Another type of bias is cognitive bias, which is kind of a catch-all type of bias. It is a systemic error in thinking that occurs when people are processing and interpreting information in the world around them, and it affects the decisions and judgments they make. Another type of bias is racial bias, which is towards a person or a racial group. And then there's appraisal bias, one that we're talking about a lot today. Now, when I did an internet search, I Googled and Binged and did DuckDuckGo on the search engines. I found over 300,000 hits. And they all directed me towards something called performance bias, performance appraisal bias. So it's important when discussing bias that we have a clear idea of what we're talking about, especially now, since there's a lot of publicity regarding appraisal bias, racial bias, valuation bias. Essentially, they're all different types of biases. So the moral of this story is that when talking about biases, make sure we're discussing the same type of biases. And that said, I'm going to discuss what type of bias, I'm going to specify what type of bias we're talking about for this presentation. And we're talking specifically about valuation bias with regards to race. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about the neuroscience of bias. Now, in order to understand bias, or in this case, unconscious bias, we need to start by looking at the neuroscience behind it. That starts with the brain, or to be more precise, portions of the brain, specifically the amygdala. The amygdala controls feelings and fear. It's part of the fight or flight mechanisms in our brain. For those that may not remember what fight or flight is, remember that's an automatic response to danger. The amygdala helps make sense of the world by sorting through hundreds of stimuli each second. From a genetic point of view, this mechanism has served humans well by pre-processing information from our environment and telling our conscious mind what to pay attention to. It's what kept us from being eaten by the saber-toothed tigers. The amygdala accomplishes this feat by filtering and forwarding alerts to our conscious mind. The amazing thing is it does this by categorizing threats based on our experiences and beliefs. This happens so fast that many times we make decisions without even realizing it. That's what makes unconscious bias implicit. Now, without getting too much into the weeds, let's take a look at the amygdala in action. Okay, so researchers can tell when someone's afraid by viewing the amygdala response on a fMRI machine. That's a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine. They know this because the part of your brain that senses fear is the amygdala, and it lights up. Initial instincts may not be based on fully processed interpretations due to their massive amounts of stimuli coming in at any second. Thus, the first instincts often include biases of some kind that we did not consciously think our brains unconsciously categorize on the experience. For example, you only need to be burned by a flame once to develop a quick instinctual reaction to fire. These emotional reactions are caused by the amygdala's survival instinct. As time passes, a person's socialization and personal memories produce unconscious biases and applies them to the amygdala processes, incoming the stimuli efficiently and unconsciously. And over time, it's common for these lower level unconscious responses to categorize people, like me or not like me, friend or foe. Or as illustrated by the slide, this person has had a traumatic experience as a child related to a pumpkin. I think we went one slide ahead. If we go back to the other slide, we're not talking. There we go. There you go. That slide. Thank you. So this person was scared by a pumpkin as a child because his sister freaked him out by reading him stories about the horseman of Sleepy Hollow. So whenever he sees a pumpkin, the input from his eyes send information to his amygdala in concert with other portions of the brain, which triggers a fear response. And an excessive fear response can result in the condition known as amygdala hijacking. Now we can go to the next slide. The amygdala hijacking happens when the amygdala overreacts to a real or perceived threat by shutting down the portions of the brain, such as the frontal lobe, hippocampus, occipital lobe, and the thalamus. Now, don't worry. This is a free seminar, and there's not going to be a test on it later. The amygdala flooding disables most of the higher functioning portions of the brain and triggers the fight or flight response. When this happens, the results often are sudden, illogical, and irrational overreactions to the situation or perceived threats. Now, without your frontal lobes, you can't think clearly, you can't make rational decisions, or control your responses. Essentially, when this happens, the control is hijacked by the amygdala. Now, I'm sure most of you folks have experienced this in your life, just like I did a couple of nights ago when I was crunching on an appraisal deadline. Now, back to you, Lisa. Thanks.
Thank you, Byron. Well, now that we have just a real light grasp on bias and that it's a natural human condition, though it is one that we can be made aware of and thus we can gain control over, we can turn to the racial bias as it relates to the appraisal profession. How is the structure of the appraisal profession designed, and where in the structure would it even be possible for racial bias to exist? In other words, where in the system could there be bias or something that is perceived as contributing to bias? If we look at the more prominent elements which together act to assure accountability and control in the appraisal profession, which I have kind of attempted to categorize here, we can better understand where in our profession bias either had a foothold in the past, has been addressed and improved upon, or weaknesses may still lie. So these elements will include the appraisal process, professional appraisal standards and ethics, having qualifications to become an appraiser, enforcement, lending clients, and diversity. If we take the 6 elements just mentioned here and we look at them on the next slide and map it over time, we can watch how it evolved and changed and where weak points may still exist. So when looking at this information, please keep in mind that this is just a graph of my own creation. It's my own personal, very, very subjective rendering meant to just try and provide a visual so everybody can kind of understand where I'm coming at, because there's a lot of information. I wanted to condense it down really quickly. The color noted on each bar indicates a loose perception of how balanced that element was for each decade as it relates to working to combat bias, meaning the color red indicates the element was contributing to bias. The color green indicates we are successfully dealing with it on some level. Yellow means there were or there still are forces that are acting in both directions, kind of those that are working for it and working against it. The final graph on this chart is blank. It's the bar that would measure bias. It's the topic we are discussing here today, and that will be left to you to conclude what level of bias you think the profession has had both over time and currently. Since you are the public and it's your opinion that matters, only you will be able to fill the bar in with what you think you hear. There are also some very specific years noted on this chart. Those years are the more important milestones in change, both positive and negative, as it relates to the ability for racial bias to exist in the profession. With this visual, we can see how the ability for racial bias to exist has, on the whole, decreased considerably over the years, and how there are still places where race-related bias could creep in. We just want to make sure that those instances are few and far between and are more a reflection not of a faulty appraisal system, but of individual human weaknesses. If you would like, this is probably a good time where you can refer to the handout provided at the beginning of this presentation. It has a much more detailed history than I would be able to discuss here today. So today I am just going to hit on some of the more important developments over time. Section 3, the history, a brief history of the appraisal profession. 1900 to 1920. In the 1890s, real estate economists and eventually appraisers started to write down their ideas on appraising. At the time these concepts were being formed, in 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court advanced the controversial separate but equal doctrine, affirming the constitutionality of racial segregation laws. Then, at the beginning of the 1900s, the first of many prevalent deed restrictions and building covenants, which stated things such as one can only build, sell, or transfer a property to people of the Caucasian race, were implemented. Many deed restrictions specifically prohibited properties from being sold to Blacks, and advertisements used codes, such as seen in the photo here, to communicate that a subdivision was racially segregated. In 1903, one of the early texts proposing an appraisal process was written by Richard Hurd. The book was more or less a summarization of known valuation theories, updated to reflect the experiences in the United States. While the entire book itself makes no mention of race or race-related concepts, the concept of the mixing of races as a bad idea was gaining steam in the United States. The concept of race impacting value was not yet codified into the appraisal process, but very soon it would make its way into what was taught to appraisers. Oh, and also, as you see on this bar chart in the lower corner, the appraisal process started out without the ratified concept of race really impacting value, though that only lasted a very short period, as we're going to see on the next slide. Before I proceed to the next slide, though, just notice how all of the other bars on the graph are red or yellow. That meant that at the turn of the 20th century, since the profession was just starting, there were no national professional appraisal standards, no qualifications to become an appraiser, no way to enforce any appraisers who acted bad, and there was certainly no diversity in the profession to speak of. In other words, without a system of controls in place, racial bias could certainly work its way into the appraisal process. And I'm going to turn to Byron here for the next slide.
Thanks again, Lisa. So, as Lisa mentioned, we've kind of broken these areas down to different time periods. So the second time period, the 1920s to the 1940s, these are essentially the years when damage to the values of homes in predominantly Black neighborhoods really began. Some extremely flawed policies were created and took hold, and their impacts are still felt to this day. While these were clearly turbulent years in America, and there were many forces pushing society in several different directions, for appraising, it was the influence of one individual that turned the appraiser profession towards a biased path. That individual was Frederick A. Babcock. Mr. Babcock had a profound influence on the appraisal profession. He was the son of an appraiser, Howard Babcock, in Chicago, Illinois, in which he and his brother Henry worked. His resume was very impressive, and he was clearly a formidable force in the early appraisal profession. He studied under Professor Richard Ely at the University of Wisconsin's School of Real Estate, and was one of the early members of the American Society of Appraisers, or the ASA, as was his brother Henry. He was one of the charter members of the American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers, the AIREA, the progenitor of the current Appraisal Institute. He was a chief evaluator at Prudential Life Insurance, as well as a chief underwriter for the FHA and later its first director. But it was his writings in particular on race that had a deep and lasting impact on the appraisal landscape. In his 1924 book, The Appraisal of Real Estate, he propagated the popular belief at the time in the real estate community that race impacted value. In chapter 3 of his volume entitled Elements of Real Estate Value, he wrote, quote, Residential values are affected by racial and religious factors, end quote. As a side note, his publication is not related to the AIREA. There was a similar publication, which is now in the 15th edition, that was first published by the progenitor of the Appraisal Institute in 1951. Babcock also published another book, The Valuation of Real Estates, in 1932, with a chapter devoted on racial valuation entitled The Influences of Social and Racial Factors on Value. Ernest Fisher, who is a real estate economist and a classmate of Babcock from the University of Wisconsin's real estate program, was instrumental in getting Babcock hired at the newly formed FHA in 1934. Babcock went on to write the first FHA Underwriter's Manual in 1934. The early editions of the Underwriter's Manual introduced the concepts of inharmonious racial and nationality groups, as well as adverse influences with regards to race. That manual, along with deed restrictions and building covenants, were firmly codifying the racial valuations in over 3,000 appraisers trained by the FHA during Babcock's tenure at the FHA. With his valuation views enshrined in the newly formed FHA, he needed tools to assist in the implementation of racial valuation. And he got some help from the local and federal government in the form of deed restriction and building covenants, as well as redlining. If you could, next slide, please. Government tools like deed restrictions, building covenants, and redlinings were not new creations, but rather they were refined between the 1920s and 40s. Lisa talked about the creation of the first building covenants and deed restrictions around the early 1900s. Redlining was an effective tool for corralling people of color. Redlining maps were used to denote risk for lending and insurance purposes. They were typically created at the local level with extensive input from realtors. These color-coded maps utilized the stoplight coding for risk. Green means to go, red means stop, blue being somewhere in between green and yellow. These maps signified the presence of any inharmonious racial or national groups. Green indicated homogeneous or no blacks, while other colors indicated either a potential mix or mixed neighborhoods. The government created a centralized repository of redlining maps through the Homeowners Lending Corporation, or HOLC, created in 1934 as a result of the New Deal. The HOLC collected data from 239 cities around the country and created redline risk maps. The FHA utilized the maps to craft their underwriting guidelines to loan on real property. As Lisa mentioned in a previous slide, deed restriction and building covenants became the local instrument of choice to steer certain ethnic, religious, and racial groups into specified regions of the city. Deed restrictions limited who could live where, and the building covenants were tied to the land and improvements. Early deed restrictions tended to discriminate against all Christians from Northern European countries, but as time passed, those groups got removed from the new deed restrictions. One thing to note is that the deed restrictions always specified Negroes. This was one group that was consistently singled out. Deed restrictions and building covenants were enforced legally, both at the local and the federal level, making it very difficult for people of color to buy or sell homes in deed restricted areas. This wasn't deemed unconstitutional at the national level until 1948 with the landmark ruling of Shelley versus Kramer. And even then, it took several decades for the full impact of this ruling to render these restrictions ineffective. Back to you, Lisa.
Thanks. All right, we're up to 1950 to 1980. Here's when the profession just starts to have the beginnings of being pulled in two different directions. Many wish to retain the past methods of taking race into consideration when valuing a property, but some specific individual appraisers started to question the logic and harm of such a practice, and they published articles and papers proposing a more objective way of viewing Black neighborhoods. At this time, society was filled with any number of legal forms of discrimination, but individuals were pushing America towards starting to address these issues one by one. And just like some individual appraisers were just starting to contemplate a way to push racism away, the society at large was also experiencing the same deep rumblings. America's laws and policies, in other words, were just starting to be dragged out into the higher courts so that those wishing to reduce racism would now be able to elicit change. And with the 1968 Fair Housing Act, the laws really began the process of changing the housing policies of America. However, it would still take quite a bit of still what I'm calling the tug of warring back and forth between those who supported the racist systems of the past and those looking to move the country in a different direction, and we are certainly not done today. While again, more and more appraisers were questioning the concept of race as having an impact on value, some appraisers were solid holdouts on the concept and concluded that the Fair Housing Act was not directed at them. They continued to practice and teach how race impacted value. That is, until the 1970s, when the United States filed a suit against several appraisal and banking organizations. The details of the lawsuit are in the handout. The lawsuit was quickly settled before trial, and the appraisal groups agreed to amend, for example, their code of professional ethics, textbooks, and education materials to teach how race was not a fact that impacted value. Still, 71 appraisers, this is in the 1970s, felt strongly enough that they wanted to file a countersuit against the government as they refused to agree that they were compelled to comply with the terms of the settlement. They eventually lost their case. This period marks a seminal point in the profession with the acceptance of what needed to change and to start taking the steps to change it. 1980 to 1990. After 1978, it takes nearly 7 years to organize. We can go one slide forward to the 1980. There we go. After 1978, it takes seven years to organize all of the appraisal groups to be able to collectively act and produce one set of uniform professional standards. It was a complicated process in part because there was no organization or group that oversaw the standards for the profession. Each individual appraisal society had on its own similar but different set of appraisal standards. Here is when that all changed. Congress authorized the Appraisal Foundation to promulgate one set of professional appraisal standards and to develop the minimum qualification criteria for becoming an appraiser. Congress also created the Appraisal Subcommittee so that they could oversee the states so we effectively could create licensing and enforcement systems for appraisers. So the bars, as you can see on our graph, are just starting to finally turn from red to green. We have a positive direction working actively against bias. 1990 to 2008, this was the time when all forces, except two, were moving towards creating the greatest number of appraisers who were regulated, educated, tested, experienced, independent, objective, accountable, and ethical. Though two elements remained elusive to improvement. One was diversity, which had not improved at all at this point, and the other was the client objectives. The client objective bar has, if you've noticed, remained yellow throughout every decade and has not moved. The client objectives being referred to here today are those of the lending client. The bar remains a steady yellow because the objectives of the lending client are truly outside the appraisal profession's ability to control. And as such, the lending client does control a significant amount of how appraisals are completed for lending work. Lenders provide roughly just under 50% of all real estate related appraisal work. So remember, we're here today mostly talking about lending. There's a whole nother world of appraising out there that has nothing to do with lending that we won't be discussing today. But we need to remember that we're focusing only on the lending work because that's what everybody does research on. Given that appraisers are typically very small mom and pop sized businesses with just one or maybe a few appraisers working under one roof, if an appraiser is one who works exclusively for lenders, and many do, then the lending client can have tremendous power and influence in the appraisal. For example, lenders issue their own forms that appraisers are required to report data on. We don't design those forms. Those come from the lender. These forms have codes that the appraisers are required to use to classify data on the forms. We don't have control over those. And the lenders issue us detailed guidance on what specific questions we must answer in the report. Meaning the appraiser and the lender have always had a very unique relationship where instead of the appraiser doing the bulk of telling the lending client what the appropriate level of work should be to complete the appraisal, the lender has written guidebooks, forms, software, and delivery systems to direct how the appraisal should be researched, written, and delivered. That is actually not all bad, as what it does do is it helps to facilitate a very efficient process so that buyers and sellers can obtain loans quickly. It also creates somewhat of a check and balance system because the lenders, before they even receive the appraisal report, are ready to compare the report to literally millions of pieces of data they have on file about real estate transactions. They, in other words, are okay with very abbreviated reports that are coded because the lender can compare nearly every detail in that report to all of the sales data in the area. And they can see and flag a report for certain types of possible violations, including those related to fair housing laws. However, it is necessary to discuss another reality that occurred on a significant number of occasions at this time and where problems were found to have emerged. The lending client can, and again during this time, many lending clients were placing a great deal of pressure on the appraiser to either make the appraisal have a specific value or the appraiser was threatened with not receiving work anymore from lending clients. It was certainly not something happening across the entire system, but it was concentrated again on the lending arm, and it was concentrated among enough certain specific lenders and enough specific appraisers that it did gain the attention of Congress. And while this topic does not directly relate to racial bias, rather it just highlights that for any appraisal problem that is related to lending to be solved, the lending clients must play a very active role in assisting with correcting the issue. They probably even have to play a lead role since their system can be minimally influenced by the individual appraiser. Regarding the overt pressure many appraisers experienced from some lending clients up until the turn of the century, Congress saw that it was a serious enough problem that they would eventually direct the appraisal subcommittee to establish a hotline for appraisers to use when they felt that they were experiencing pressure to hit a number. Congress also went on to, as Byron will note on the next slide, pass new laws to help assist lenders in removing the tendency to pressure or influence appraisers. Byron?
Thank you, Lisa. Now, that takes us to the present, 2010 to 2020. So many of us remember the effects of the financial crisis of 2008, also known to us as the mortgage meltdown of 2008 to 2010. Not a pretty time to be in the real estate business, especially if you're an appraiser. There was a lot of blame going around. And like now, much of it was directed at appraisers, most of whom had little or no contribution to the defaulted loans. And as Lisa just mentioned, the result of this meltdown were two significant pieces of legislation: the Home Valuation Code of Conduct, or the HVCC, and the Dodd-Frank Act. Most of you are probably familiar with the HVCC and Dodd-Frank. The Home Valuation Code of Conduct was a set of federal guidelines between the Federal Housing Financial Agency, or the FHFA, Freddie Mac, and the New York Attorney General's Office in 2009. It was intended to address some of the conditions that created the meltdown and protect the public trust. It sought to reduce the likelihood of another meltdown by insulating appraisers from the mortgage origination personnel. The HVCC was in place a little over a year and was sunset in October of 2010 after the then President Barack Obama signed the Dodd-Frank Act. Now, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010 is over a 2,300-page piece of legislation that responded to the 2008 financial crisis. It created several new agencies tasked with overseeing various components of the act. The act targeted sectors of the financial system, including banks, mortgage lenders, credit agencies, and good old appraisers. Dodd-Frank took key components of the HVCC in the mortgage lending and appraiser subsection of the Dodd-Frank legislation. And in May of 2018, the Trump administration took steps to roll back portions of that law that some argued made the U.S. uncompetitive. Okay, back to you, Lisa.
Okay. Well, now that we have just a very high level understanding of the history of the appraisal profession, again, as it relates specifically to lending and bias related issues, we now get to where we're going to explore what data we could find or what might be available. Bias data. Are appraisers racially biased? Can we even measure bias? I mean, who's measuring it and what questions are they trying to answer? What data are they looking at to see if something has racial bias or does not have bias? Do we even have enough understanding of the appraisal process to adequately recommend solutions to the problems? Who's best equipped to be able to identify bias, racial bias in the appraisal? Just like when an appraiser is looking to solve an appraisal problem, to solve any problem where data is needed, the first step is to understand what data is available, which the other researchers absolutely alluded to, that we don't have all the data we need, which I will be showing you I absolutely agree with. If a researcher is able to identify and study all of the elements that could contribute to bias, just like an appraiser seeks to do, and then the goal of using that data is always, just like they did, to discuss the known strengths and weaknesses of the data set so that we don't just try and prove our point and discard things that don't fit in with what we're doing. Appraisers are trained to deal with data in that way. Credible conclusions are based on an honest look at what data you have available and objectively presenting that data before attempting to draw a conclusion. Starting with a goal of attempting to find a certain type of answer, just as appraiser knows, is starting the entire research process from a bias standpoint. So to see if we can understand how to find racial bias in the appraisal, we can just this is lightly touching on some of the possible data sources to see what they might say. In other words, a significant part of the appraisal process is to collect data and understand what is happening in a market, and more importantly, how often it is happening. The data must be gathered from all angles like we do, and it must not be culled of any weaknesses, because weakness in data is a part of all research. If we are tasked with looking for racial bias in appraisals, in order to understand how big the problem may be or may not be, we also have to look to find where bias is not happening in appraisals, when it is not present. To research one without the other leads to assignment results that would not be credible in a report that is misleading. Here we will start a short list of some of the data points we were able to gather that can give us an understanding of some of the accusations, the probability, or the possible frequencies of the number of appraisals completed with and without appraisal bias. Realtors and selling. So do realtors have an opinion if appraisers are acting with racial bias? From a statistical standpoint, I have no idea. I could not find any data that indicated a direct answer to this question. But what I could find is something that has a very, very loose indication of how much of the impact appraisals in general have on the buying process as viewed from the realtor's point of view. Realtors indicated earlier this year, that's where this study comes from. Actually, this study is just from a month ago. But earlier this year, when the pandemic began, contracts that did not close rose to an atypical high level of around 15%. So at that time, the market looked like it may be crashing. But then almost as suddenly, the market completely heated back up, and that level fell back down to a more normal 5% of transactions not closing. Of that 5% of properties that go under contract, how many were because of any type of appraisal issue? 13%. Thus, most properties which are placed under contract eventually close. But what I want to point out is just how often deals have to be renegotiated while under contract. Somewhere between 20 and 35% of all deals have to be renegotiated. What does this have to do with bias? Well, nothing. It just shows how adaptive a market is and how the appraisal, even if they are below the original under contract price, is not the main reason that deals fall apart. Appraisals cause less than 1% of all deals to fall apart. In a normal market, not like in the overheated one that we have right now, it's not uncommon for sales prices to be negotiated to the appraised value when the appraised value is below the original contract price. And remember, when buyers and sellers agree to a sales price, they have no access to any past or present appraised values. Appraised values are not market data that the market uses to make decisions. They are private reports to lenders on what buyers and sellers are doing. So they are information that's kept private that are provided to lenders. Lending and purchases. Here's another data slide. If we look at this slide independent of the prior slide, we might conclude, oh, well, around 65% of all appraisals come in above contract price, 20 come in below contract or right at contract price, and just a few come in below. So that looks like bias to me. Does that indicate a racial bias or maybe a different kind of bias? This data is not something that can indicate if appraisals have racial bias or not. But what it does do is show the importance of understanding everything about the details of the data used to generate a conclusion before trying to interpret what the graph that it produces means. The data is actually commonly and incorrectly used to attempt to support a conclusion that appraisers continually have a confirmation bias, meaning we just appraise to the contract price, so what is the point of using appraisers? We can save the topic of confirmation bias for another day, basically when we have time to talk about things such as the rules of rounding, negotiation zone, the most probable price, bracketing, or even that the sales comparison approach reflects what buyers pay. This is the information lenders request from appraisers. And if asked, appraisers would just as easily report the cost and only the cost of the property if that was the information the lenders needed. Lenders, in other words, make their lending decisions based on what buyers pay, which is the cost of sales comparison approach. They do not base their decisions on what a property costs to build. That's their decision, again, outside of what we have control over. As of today, our key point, much like the prior slide showed, is to point out that to draw a conclusion about data requires a deep understanding of all the processes in place that dictate why the data is reported the way it is. So take this slide to just be an indication that if appraisers have racial bias, then by deduction, maybe this graph is saying that bias would only impact appraisals significantly less than 10% of the time, since that's the percentage of appraisals that end up below final sales price. Though truthfully, I totally admit this graph tells us absolutely nothing about racial bias. Research, lending and research. Research is continually being done on appraisals related to lending to see if they are low or high. The conclusions are all over the place, though most tend to conclude that appraisals are too high. What does this tell us about racial bias? No, it just tells us that research papers conclude a lot of different things about appraisals. It helps to understand many different research papers when studying conclusions made about the profession. There are certainly a good deal of research papers on appraisers and bias, though it was only in the last 2 years that we started to see research papers on the very specific topic of racial bias. While it is not necessary to discuss the studies noted here on this slide, they are all included in references in your handout given at the beginning of this talk. Research on racial bias is a newer topic. And while, as we will see, data is still a bit on the thin side, though the presenters who just spoke before us today appeared to be onto something when their work gravitated towards studying the individual appraisal and not attempting to data crunch millions of appraisals to draw conclusions about racial bias. Let me give you more on that. Lending, purchase loan denial rates. This slide gives us the tiny inclination of how large of a problem racial biases in valuation may or may not be. It gives us information about denial rates, who's getting the loans. This data and the data on the next slides are all taken from what is known as HMDA data. It's publicly available free data on mortgage transactions made available via the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. This data tells us just a little bit about how often appraisals cause different races to receive a loan denial related to a purchase. And when I say a little bit, I mean it, because the data does not track specifically just the appraisal. It tracks collateral, which includes a lot more than just the appraisal, but the appraisal is in that part of the data set. So it would be the appraisal causing a problem would be a little bit less than what you see here, because that accounts for a lot more than just the appraisal. Thus, we can conclude that it is typical for any person, depending on their race, to be denied at a loan at the time of the purchase for up to, but not over 19% of the time based on the collateral, which includes the appraisal. The group with the lowest denial rate based on race is the Asian population. The second slide about loan denials based on race, like the prior slide, this is just another example of how often loans are denied in each individual race. This data, again, is available on the HMDA data site, and it's very abbreviated here. So I would highly recommend that you go to the site to understand the lending denial rates based on race. This, again, is another slight indicator of how large the problem may be related to racial bias in appraisals. Again, a bit of a stretch, but this is all we can come up with at this point. Whites and Asians are denied loans more often based on collateral, which seems to indicate racial bias may not be a systemic problem. Rather, it may be one that is more at the individual level, though again, we really don't have enough information to draw that conclusion. So let's keep looking. Enforcement, HUD. An obvious place to look to see if we can find instances where appraisers are indicated to have racial bias is with the National Fair Housing Association. They accept complaints every year on fair housing related complaints. For appraisals, there are no complaints noted, but that does not indicate racial bias simply does not exist. It just means that perhaps this is not the place people go to when looking to file a complaint against appraisal reports that have indications of racial bias in them. Enforcement on the state level. So there are roughly 80,000 appraisers in the United States who, again, this is a very rough average, perform over 1 million appraisals every month. And about half of those are done for lending. So we got half of the profession working on lending appraisals, the other half, a whole other different set of clients that we work for. Very, very, very roughly, we can estimate that 3,000 or so appraisals every year will have a complaint filed against them at the state level. But that's for every and all reasons. So you got 1 million appraisals happening a month, and about 3,000 a year are filed for complaints. And again, this is not just for racially biased reasons that the complaints are filed. Of all of those that go through the complaint process, about 10% receive some manner of discipline. And again, all of this data right here, I truly mean roughly. The data is very difficult to collect, as there is no central source for understanding how many complaints are made, what types of complaints are made, and exactly how many cases result in discipline. So does this tell us how many appraisals have racial bias in them? Unfortunately, no, it does not tell us anything more than the fact that there are about 12 million appraisals done a year and about 1% have a complaint filed against them. What we can learn from this data is that here at the state enforcement level is probably the best place for one to attempt to collect data on racial bias, and one for us to make aware to people that this is the place to go when you suspect a problem in an appraisal. The states are equipped with experts in understanding the appraisal process and are able to effectively interpret an appraisal report made for the lender, and thus render a fair and equitable decision about the complaints filed on individual appraisals. The states are the only ones who truly oversee and enforce the appraisal profession. And if we want to start to show how large the problem is, we can't solve this issue without seeing what outcomes complaints have. Appraisals. So if we can't find a large data set that is able to study racial bias, does that mean it doesn't exist? No. It just means we might have to end up looking at individual appraisals to really understand how and when racial bias can creep into the appraisal. To get an idea of what an appraiser does versus how the lending appraisal report is a necessarily condensed version of the work the appraiser does, I recommend Googling what a narrative appraisal report looks like. A narrative appraisal report is a full explanation of all the research an appraiser typically undertakes. It is one way for a non-appraiser to understand some of what an appraiser does versus what is written, what is meant to be a very abbreviated report prepared for the lender. Now we're going to go off on a little bit of a side topic for a second, but this is actually deeply important to understand here. Go back one slide. That this lending report, which is a form report that homeowners receive a copy of, is not written for them to understand. Rather, it is the product the lender requires to be written. Again, their format, their form, using their codes, their labels. So what we, the profession, observe that happens is that it is very common for a homeowner who feels an appraised value is low and who does understandably not have the training to fully understand how to read these coded appraisal reports, misinterprets the reports, and files a complaint against the appraiser. 75% of all complaints come from this source. They actually don't even come from the client. And of those complaints, about 10% go on to be subjected to discipline. In other words, to fully understand how big the problem of racial bias is or is not, we must also acknowledge is that not all cases of alleged racial bias are that. Instead, they are just the natural outcome of what would be expected when a report is designed more for a computer to read, and that report uses the words, codes, and labels that the lenders require the appraiser to use. And every lender has a different set of codes. FHA, Fannie, Freddie, they all have different guidelines for us. And since the lending appraiser is so specifically written for lenders, and each type of lender has their own reporting requirements, it makes it extremely difficult for a non-appraiser or a non-state regulator to understand all the codes and reporting nuances behind what they observe in the report. Misunderstandings come from homeowners not being equipped with the tools to fully interpret these appraisals. So let's look at individual appraisals now. So here we are at the level of the individual. The individual appraisal and they all have a personal responsibility to understand how bias can creep into their reports. Since we got this far and ended up with only a very vague understanding of how we can even go about truly understanding how big racial bias is in the appraisal and how often it occurs or how to even detect it, does that mean the appraiser is off scot-free? No, just the opposite. Since racial bias, as we have just seen, can hide so well, as it can be very difficult to even track, that does not mean the appraisals are free to do and commit racial bias. It looks like, as the researchers seem to be discovering themselves, the only way we can understand how racial bias can appear in a lending report is to study the words used in the individual appraisal reports. While it would be a great idea to use the UAD data set, and we would all love to see that, you always have to keep in mind that that is a set designed by the lender with their codes, not our codes. Overall, we have to understand where the individual fits in this process. Byron is now going to discuss racial bias in detail. Byron?
Thank you, Lisa. Now we're going to get into the meat and the potatoes of this topic. That is appraising and bias. But before we do that, I want you to recall earlier in the presentation, we discussed the different types of bias that we're talking about when we discuss bias. It's important to clarify what the type of bias we're talking about. Therefore, within the context of our discussion, we've narrowed it to 3 types of bias related to racial evaluation bias. And they are explicit bias, structural bias, and implicit bias. And now I'm going to talk about each one of these and how it relates to the appraiser and the appraisal process. If we could go to the next slide, please. The first type of bias we're going to discuss is explicit bias. This one's the easiest to understand since it's conscious. It's the tip of the proverbial iceberg. It's what you see above the waterline. Going back to our earlier discussion on bias, remember that bias may be positive, negative, or neutral. So referring back to my earlier jelly example with Mrs. Brewer, her proclamation preferring grape jelly was explicit in its bias. It was also conscious, since she thought about it, and it was overt, since she was proudly proclaiming her love of grape jelly to a snot-nosed 8-year-old. Circling back to appraising and bias, conscious bias in appraising may be positive, negative, or neutral as well. I had an appraiser last week tell me that she loves appraising prairie-style historic homes, and she tends to overvalue them when doing relocation appraising. Now, that's an example of positive valuation bias in appraising, one that affects the overvalue of real estate. But you might be asking yourself, is this an example of racist? I don't think so. In this example, while it is an example of valuation bias, it's not racial valuation bias. And one last question to ponder before I moved on to the next example is, does she do harm by overvaluing a property to the public trust? Does she do harm to the public trust by overvaluing a property? Now, okay, what about an appraiser that is appraising a residential home for mortgage purposes in a socially economically disadvantaged neighborhood? Now, that's a mouthful, and I have trouble saying that. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to say disadvantaged neighborhood, and you'll know what I'm talking about. And when this appraiser indicates that this area of town has a lot of crime and that the people who live there don't work because they're lazy Puerto Ricans and want to milk the system. He further goes on to tell us that he's always appraises homes for 25% less on the Puerto Rican side of the I-90. Now, would you say that this is an example of explicit bias? You bet your bottom dollar it is. While it's an exaggeration, it's a variant of a story that an appraiser felt comfortable to share with me years ago. So it is conscious racist, and this appraiser harms the public trust by violating being fair, impartial, and unbiased. And I would add that he also violates the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So explicit bias with regard to race appraising is a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1965 and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And that brings us to structural bias. Next slide, please. Now, in my opinion, structural bias is one of the appraisers is the one that appraisers are inherited or are stuck with, depending upon how you look at it. That is, there are all these historic, that was Freudian, all these historic influences that are baked into the system that we have to live with. If you recall from our earlier discussion regarding deed restriction, building covenants, redlining, and early FHA underwriting guidelines, these were all systemic obstacles put in place to limit the movement and the transfer of wealth for people of color. Moreover, these influences over time caused similar communities, with the only difference being race, to have differing values. Now, when appraising in these historically oppressed neighborhoods, we are limited to high and low values of property values. These are the guardrails for the valuations. Appraisers are using the sales comparison approach and are limited in general to develop an opinion of value within the guardrails for the neighborhood when doing mortgage lending. Now, let's back up for a minute, because I want to clarify a statement, because some of you might be listening to me going, oh, wait a minute, Miller. All right. Yeah, yep, you're talking smack here. You contradicted yourself. Now, to clarify the previous statement regarding the similar communities have different value, while that last statement I made about similar communities may make you think, why don't we just make a racial locational adjustment for the depressed neighborhood and call it a day? Well, the dirty truth is, even though neighborhoods may have been equal when they were created, they are not similar now 100 years later. And that's because the same systemic policies at the state and federal level have not invested in infrastructure and maintenance of these neighborhoods for decades. This in turn leads to deferred maintenance on a neighborhood level, which impacts the external adverse influences that we as appraisers have to consider. It is the same adverse influences that Babcock wrote about almost 100 years ago, but now it has different meaning to our valuation process. Pre-Fair Housing Act, adverse influences included code of conduct, code words like crime, blockbusting, pride of ownership. They were in the appraisal reports for describing the racial makeup of a neighborhood. Post-Fair Housing Act, appraisers are not allowed to use such code words and are trained to appraise without bias. But we are limited in our range of values by guardrails of the neighborhoods based on historical constraints that have caused structural bias. Next slide, please. Now that brings us to implicit bias. It is the last type of bias that we're going to discuss in this session, or I'm going to discuss. If you recall, we discussed the neuroscience of implicit bias earlier in this presentation. Just a refresher course in case you forgot. Implicit bias is unconscious. Implicit bias in appraising differs from the other two types in that it impacts value without the appraiser's conscious awareness. Appraising with both explicit and structural bias operates on the conscious level. Implicit bias happens without us knowing. This unknowing may creep into our valuation opinions. As I said in the last slide, I think structural bias has the greatest impact on value, but implicit bias value may not be taken lightly either, since implicit bias may impact a significant portion of the appraised property value. Now keep in mind that the appraisal process is structured and it leaves little places for implicit bias. Now that said, where might it creep in? Examining the appraisal process, three areas come to mind: location, quality, and condition. All of you, you're all familiar with that. These three have a subjective or qualitative component to them, which relies on the appraisal's experience and perception. In the case of location, the appraiser may consider adverse influence for externalities. Personal opinions may be made in situations where quantitative methods are inconclusive, such as externalities. For example, let's take the case of a home near a school. There may be those that consider it a plus for that externality, especially since they have school-aged children. On the other hand, if a couple purchasing as an empty nester, they may view that as a detriment. And this is where the appraiser's opinion may weigh in to make an adjustment. And this is an area ripe for implicit bias. Quality adjustments may also be influenced by implicit bias. When making this type of adjustment, I like to remind myself that one person's trash is another person's gold. And this especially holds true for quality adjustments, because quality adjustment differences happen frequently in appraising. The last adjustment where implicit bias may happen is on condition. Condition is very subjective, and it provides the opportunity for appraiser bias to influence the adjustment. Which brings me to the last point regarding implicit bias. Since all humans have some kind of implicit bias, we need a way to identify it. And one way to do that is through an implicit bias test that's developed at the Harvard University. Next slide, please. So we are appraisers. As my supervisor told me when I was a trainee, we are lucky, lucky men. He would tell me that every day when we went out before we inspected. Because one of our primary functions as appraisers is to protect the public trust. And by doing that, it is our duty and responsibility to produce a bias-free appraisal. So in order to do that, we need to short circuit the process, or as I like to call it, bias bust. So we need to be able to, and we need to identify and test for this bias. So the first two types of racial valuation bias are easy to locate and test for. The last one from the last section we talked about on implicit bias is more tricky since we don't know what we're not aware of. So the first thing to bias bust is to figure out what our own biases are. And one way to do that is to take a test. Whoa, wait a minute. You might be saying, wait a minute, you said this was free and we're not going to be tested. Well, you can do this on your own time. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the Harvard IAT, or Implicit Association Test, is a way to discover your implicit biases. It was created in 1995, and since then, over 1.5 million people have taken this test to discover their implicit biases. As I just said, awareness is the first step in rooting out bias in your report. At the risk of oversharing, the results of my IAT indicated that I have a slight positive bias towards Black folks, which may surprise you or may not surprise you. Once you've identified the bias, focus on how to change the behavior that may have caused the bias. The next step is to challenge your own stereotypes. One paper I read, the author of that paper, she shared an experience she had while walking down this busy street in a downtown during the middle of the day. She's walking down the street and there's this well-dressed Black man on the sidewalk coming towards her, and she caught herself clutching her purse. And then she realized, whoa, wait a minute. I'm a researcher. I have a PhD. I know better than this. This is my implicit bias. My amygdala, I can't say it. My amygdala. There we go. I got to slow it down. In action. It was short-circuiting her and causing a fear response. So her thing was she attacked it from a high level. She let her conscious mind take over and attack that low-level bias that was percolating up. And the last thing that we can talk about that can do bias busting as an appraiser or as a human is to seek out other people different than yourself. And this might be the most challenging. A recent study indicated that most Caucasians don't have any real friends of color. Now, folks of you that are listening, coworkers don't count, okay? People that you don't do stuff with outside of work or you never invited them to your house, they don't count. Okay, I got lots of coworkers like that to say, hey, Byron, you're my Black friend. And I'm like, well, I've never been over to your house. We don't do anything outside of work, so they don't count. All right, surrounding ourselves with folks different than ourselves forces us to confront additional biases that we're not aware of and makes for a more diverse existence. Last slide, please. Or last of my slides. Thank you. The summary. Now I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for tuning into our session. I enjoyed creating it and working with the amazing Lisa Damaris. I hope you found that it was informative and a good use of your time. Before turning it over to Lisa for her summary, let me recap what we discussed in case you were sleeping through part of this. Now, I started off talking about the neuroscience of bias. Then I talked about an influential appraiser who has his hands all over our profession, Fred Babcock. I talked about the historical influences that created structural biases and the governmental organization that codified its policies of structural bias. I then discussed in detail specific types of racial bias valuation and concluded with some bias busting techniques that will allow you to produce bias-free reports. And now back to you, Lisa, one last time.
Thank you. We can. I just want to add here that I was pleased to work with the amazing Byron Miller. I think we discovered we are 2 peas in the pod and just cannot get enough data. So it has been a pleasure to work with you, Byron. Now, because bias is such a natural tendency, and the appraisal profession had a history of blatantly teaching and promoting the development of value opinions, which were based on the concept that race impacted value, we have no right to run and hide from this topic and just hope that appraisers understand not to be biased or discriminatory in their work. Our job is to find where racial bias exists and then to give appraisers tools to understand it, to guard against it, and to eliminate it. The concept and the topic has risen in importance over the years in the profession from something that was simply mentioned and discouraged to something that has been gaining more and more importance as needing to be continually guarded against. It is something that can never, ever fall beneath the radar. It's too easy to slip into bias, especially bias one is not fully aware of, and maintaining a vigilance against it is a must. For the appraisal profession to continue its path towards independence, objectivity, and a lack of bias, we have to operate in a world that recognizes these goals as worthwhile. We are the only part of the lending process that is the independent actor. Every other party, the homeowner, the lender, all have a vested interest in the appraisal having a specific outcome. Still are human, and we, like any other profession, contain humans who fail to uphold those standards, but we also have today a significantly large portion of our profession being horrified when they see accusations of an appraiser discriminating against someone because they are Black. The appraisal profession has a very good system in place, but it's not perfect, and it can be improved upon. We have a very keen and open acknowledgement of where we've been, what has changed, and what its current strengths and weaknesses are as they relate to race, bias, and discrimination. The public today just wants to know if we are who we once were, or if we have evolved, or if we're even truly able as a profession to treat all persons equally. I'm here, along with Byron, to state that, in my opinion, being asked to start to answer the questions directed at the profession about racial bias is an honor. We very much needed to be part of the conversation that's being had in the public about our profession. We're happy that this topic is being discussed in public. We want to be fully open and transparent about our process. We want the public to tell us how they see our profession and to question what our process is. Up until now, and probably because our profession is made up of such a relatively small number of people, researchers in the media have been drawing conclusions and recommending solutions to others about how our profession should change without directly consulting, engaging, or communicating with our recognized experts in the appraisal process. So being here today is that huge step forward as we're all able to join in the conversation and understand each other's point of view. We recognize that being asked to answer questions about the appraisal process is a positive indication that we can contribute to both knowing and solving any issues that remain to be resolved. Thank you. And now we can probably go to questions.
Okay, Lisa and Byron, thank you both so much. I think your presentation really builds upon what we heard in the first presentation and maybe helps set some context for people about what bias means and how, or some of the things that they may need to be on the lookout for. Johnny, I would defer to you for the first question if you would like, or I'd be happy to take it. You just let me know.
Go ahead and take that first one, Jim.
Okay, fire away.
No, I was saying you take the first one.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, Johnny, misunderstood you. All right. Well, the first question we had was if an appraisal for a single family dwelling under a sales contract appraised for less than the sales contract, historically, did the seller adjust the purchase price? Did it allow for the minority purchaser to qualify under FHA, Freddie Mac, or Fannie Mae guidelines under capacity of borrower to repay the debt? Any thoughts on that from either Lisa or Byron, or from both?
That's a huge question that probably involves a lot more than I could probably even address here today. I mean, it has to do with markets varying over time. You know, why did it appraise low? So I probably can't answer that unless you guys have some direct input on that here.
I would concur.
Okay. Well, with that, I'm not sure I have much to add to that either. Johnny, if you'd like to take the second question.
Sure. Let's go to the next question here because I don't have anything to add to that either. Let's get to this one. Sorry, just went off my page here. Here we go. Okay. This question is from Mark. Lisa, does the graphic on lending purchases take into account how many sale prices are renegotiated to a revised sales price when the appraisal comes in below the initial contracted sale price?
I don't think so. Since that's HMDA data, which is the data that the lenders collect on the loans, I don't think it does.
Okay.
All right. Another question we had here for both the panelists. Implicit bias was identified in low to moderate income areas when flips, fraudulent mortgages, condo conversion projects, etc., utilizing HUD financing caused foreclosures. Let's see, it says collusion lenders, mortgage brokers, real estate agents, and appraisers, were they all parties to the transaction?
Right, I think you're talking about prior to the market bust in 2008, where that's where all this Dodd-Frank came out of, because they discovered there was that element. There were certain appraisers who were working with certain realtors, working with certain fix and flip people that were able to make that type of a system work, and they shouldn't have been able to. So it was identified, and that was kind of part of the goal of what Dodd-Frank was seeking to answer.
So there was a question that was asked in the last presentation. So if we as appraisers are tasked to be mirrors to reflect the market, how do we correct those racially related issues? If we choose the appropriate comps for a subject property, and those comps are affected by the same systematic racial issues as the subject property, how do we correct the systematic racial issues?
I think I could take a stab at that. We talked about implicit bias and structural bias. Remember, those are kind of the rails, and yes, we do kind of inherit those. Things like what we're doing today with education. And getting, collaboratively with other organizations and our federal regulators. Those are things that we can do to kind of address this. But to your question, yes, we are kind of limited by the existing neighborhood. So I kind of talked about that when I did touch on structural bias.
And if I can add to that, like Byron just said, there's a big part of this that's about education. And because of this whole topic and how it's evolved, the Appraisal Foundation and its board, the Appraisal Standards Board and the Appraisal Qualifications for this year are absolutely steeped in new proposed changes. They're gonna come out and present next year. Some of them include greater education every 2 years around the topic of bias. Because this is so important, we probably need more awareness of the issue.
And absolutely, Jim, before you go to this next question, I'll also state here, and Byron, I think you did a great job there in talking about the different types of biases. And as you talk about unconscious bias, we all have that. We just need to understand and be aware of that unconscious bias. And once we're aware of it, we can address it. And you gave a great example of the researcher saying, African-American male was walking towards and she clutched her purse. She recognized that she had that bias and she addressed it. So that's, if we could recognize that, I think that helps.
So this is a tough question, I think, to get to the root of, because we've heard so much in our appraisal career, it's location, 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 right? And lenders oftentimes are requesting that the comps be preferably within some certain distance of the subject property, whether that's 1 mile or whatever the case may be. If we're to believe what the researchers say, that the location has built-in or structural biases, what is the appraiser supposed to do in terms of selecting comps? How can they help overcome that issue to the extent they believe it exists in their market?
Well, you have to, for everything that the appraiser does, you always have to go back to look at what are the buyer and seller doing. If they are leaving the area to look for data to understand the value that they're going to offer in a certain subdivision, then we would follow. We follow behind buyers and sellers and watch every move they make. If they make delineations of that this is the only neighborhood they want to live in, then if we leave that neighborhood and we don't explain why we're leaving that neighborhood, we can end up with a bias or subjectivity that is negative or positive. Does that help answer the question? Or Byron, do you want to add to that?
Well, it's really more anecdotal and local, and I'm sure most people can relate to their personal markets. Think about each market that you're in, each city, it has what's perceived as the good part and the bad part. And we as appraisers, we try to mirror what's going on in the marketplace. And so you have to ask yourself, would a typical buyer for this particular area consider that other area, based on amenities, demographics, price, etc. And I know that, like, I use that argument all the time in my area because I appraise in a disadvantaged neighborhood, one that I actually grew up in quite frequently. And, this was an old Jewish neighborhood back in the 20s when my dad grew up there, and there's beautiful houses there. And the same over, that are the same houses that are over where I live now, which is kind of a, she, frou. It has nothing to do with me, but my neighbors are she, frou. And
Byron, I need to know what she, frou means.
Oh, okay, all right, cake eater. Okay. And so these houses are, the housing stock is very similar, but there is a huge discrepancy. I actually ran some statistics recently and found that there's a discrepancy of $500,000 difference. Now, would that person in that disadvantaged neighborhood, would they consider living in that neighborhood? Yes. Could they afford it? That's another story. Right. And conversely, would the other person who could afford to live in the, more affluent, okay, I'll just be more generic and not offensive, I'm a simple guy, would they choose to live in that type of neighborhood? And, I'm not making any value judgments here. I'm just, I look at this from an appraisal point of view and a student of human, human studies.
Can I just add one more point? So someone just asked, what is a typical buyer? And they said, what's it based on? Their income, their race, what is it? And it's based on the actions we see happen the most. So when we look at, let's just pretend you have a property for sale and 60 people make an offer on that property. They're going to be all over the board, but some of that data is going to cluster at one spot. That's your typical buyer. What actions they took has nothing to do with that person's race, income, or anything else.
Absolutely. I would agree with you. We're really talking about, as appraisers, it's a statistical thing, right? Yes. We're talking about mean, median, or mode.
Well, I want to be sensitive to everyone's time. Johnny, I think we probably have time for one more question if you have one at the ready. And
I see the last question here was from John. I think we kind of covered that. What specific changes do you believe lenders need to make in regards to the form reports? Any other comments related to that?
Well, I mean, it is their form. These are their codes, and it's not so much that they need to change them. It's that it's making the marketplace understand that it's difficult for them to read and interpret the forms because those codes are directed by the lender. And everybody has an interest in these transactions moving along quite quickly. So we don't have time for appraisers to write big and narrative reports for every single appraisal. So you're going to have to end up with a coded form like you have if you want this process to move quickly, which has pros and cons to it.
Okay, well, I want to thank you both for a lot of thoughtful comments and time that you put into the presentations. Really do appreciate your time. Amy has posted over in the chat box a link to a survey on this particular session, so we can continue to improve as we offer these. I'd also like to recommend tomorrow signing up for the two events. Tomorrow, the first session beginning at 1 o'clock Eastern Time will be a sneak peek at the 117th Congress and the next administration. And that session will be followed by a panel of lenders talking about moving forward with innovative financing. And some of the things they talk about, I think, will parallel closely with what you heard the previous researchers talk about in the first session. So everybody, thank you so much. Johnny, thank you for co-moderating. Lisa and Byron, once again, thank you both so much for your time today. And for everybody, we hope to see you back here tomorrow, same bat time, but a different bat channel. There'll be different links for you to sign up for. So make sure that you are clicking on the right links. And with that, we'll bid you a fond adieu. Thank you, everyone.